In this video, we're going to see how we can open up a Spring Boot project in IntelliJ IDEA, the popular Java IDE, and demonstrate how we can run the application and also how we can debug the application so we can step through it and see exactly what's happening within the application itself. So first off, if I open up IDEA, so I'm using IntelliJ IDEA Community Edition 2019.1, which is the free version. You might be using the ultimate version if you're working for a large organization, which has a few more features. But this is perfectly good for starting out with, and in general for day-to-day development. I'm a professional Java software developer, and actually I've never bought IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate Edition, although I've used it in other companies which have provided it, but this is perfectly adequate for most needs. So, I have a basic demo project which I generated with the Spring Initializer website. Doesn't have any dependencies in there, it's based on Maven. Let's just open it now. So if I go to Open, and inside my Downloads folder, there's a demo project here you can see with a pom.xml file. And if I just click the pom.xml file and open, then it's going to open it as a project if I choose this one. And what that means is it's going to interpret it as a Maven project, which means that the Maven plugin you can see here has been initialized. So if I click there, you can see that gives me an overview of the lifecycle. So those are the different phases that I can execute as part of the default build lifecycle in Maven. You can see I've also got plugins, which are the particular plugins that this project's going to use. And of particular interest in a Spring Boot project, of course, is the Spring Boot plugin here. And if I open up that, you'll see the actual goals that I can execute on that plugin, which effectively gives us helpful build targets we can call to work with Spring Boot apps. Close that. And then we can see we've got dependencies. So all Maven projects have a dependencies section, and you can see here this particular project, if I just go over here to the Project Explorer and double click to open the pom.xml file, you can see here I have two dependencies which are explicitly included in the dependencies section, Spring Boot Starter Test, and you can see here that corresponds to these two here, so Spring Boot Starter Test. And what's nice about this view as well is if I open up one of these, so for example here, you can see that under Spring Boot Starter, underneath this dependency, these are the dependencies which it depends on. So you'll notice, for example, Spring Boot Starter also depends on Spring Core 527, because 231 of Spring Boot is based on 527 of the Spring framework, and in turn, Spring Core, for example, brings in Spring JCL, which is its logging library. And in fact, if I close that, I go over here into external libraries, we can see the full collection of libraries that have been brought into this project through just those two top level dependencies. So let's just close those and quickly demo how we can run the project then. So we can run the project by double clicking the Spring Boot Run goal of the Spring Boot plugin in the Maven pane. So if I double click there, you can see now that it run the application. Of course, the application doesn't have any dependencies in there which would keep the application running. So for example, a web dependency. So it closes straight away, but nevertheless, that's one way how you can run a project. Another way, if I close this off, is to go inside source main Java and look for the actual demo application. This is the Spring Boot application itself. And if I just right click on there, and do run demo application.main. And this time it's running the application, but it's not running the application through Maven itself. Instead, it's running it through this command line here, which you can see. Similarly, if I wanted to debug the application instead of running it, then I could just select to debug instead. So if I just open this up here, for example, and set a breakpoint here, so the debugger will stop at this point when we're running in debug mode. Again, if I right click and go to debug, now you can see that we're actually debugging the application. So here you can inspect any variables. So for example, here are the args that are passed in. Of course, there are no arguments that are passed in, so this is why this is empty, and you can't double click on it to expand or see any values. This is where you have a call hierarchy, which shows you the sequence of calls leading up to the current call. But of course, since this is a main method, this is the top level method in an application, we only see one so-called stack frame here, or one call here, which is inside this class demo application itself. And we can also see as well the threads used in the application. So here we've just effectively got one thread, which is of consequence to us, which is the main thread. So things you can do once you're at a breakpoint, you can either step into code. So for example, if I hit F7 to step into, you can also see these as well if you go into run. You can see the various debug navigation shortcuts you can use here. So if I do step into with F7, then that's now stepping into Spring Boot's code itself. And you can see here we've got an extra frame now because we've made an extra call, so now we're inside Spring application. We could do F7 again, for example. Now we're in another method which happens to be in the same class. And you can also press F8 to step over the current line, which basically executes that line and goes to the next line, or if that line is the last line in a method, we'll jump back up to the calling method. And you can do Shift F8 to jump out from a method, to jump back out to the caller, and effectively play the rest of the method that you've actually stepped into. Or you can hit F9, which just means run the rest of the application from here, which I've just done there. So we won't step through the Spring Boot application code, the framework code that is, now, because obviously we don't want to get too carried away with things and we don't want to run before we can walk. But that was just a nice introduction how you can run and debug your Spring Boot applications in the IDE using IntelliJ IDEA.